Hello. Today, our guest is Albert Skip Rizzo, and we will be talking about virtual reality and neuroscience. Don't go away. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Cruzamento Podcast. In today's show, we will talk about the intersection of technology, healthcare, and sustainability. My name is Daniel Gdelha, and together with me is my friend and co-host, André Correia.
Hello and welcome to another show of the Cruzamento podcast. Our guest today is Albert Skip Rizzo. Hello, Skip. Very welcome to this new season of the show. Skip, to start off with, let us ask you our very first usual question. In 30 seconds, who is Albert Skip Rizzo?
Oh boy. I'm a person that is very interested in using advanced technology to improve healthcare, particularly mental health and rehabilitation. I'm a clinical psychologist, and really my focus is specifically on how can we leverage the power of virtual reality for a wide range of clinical activities that are going to benefit a lot of people now, especially that the technology is caught up with the vision.
Wow, leverage the power of VR. And you are the director of medical virtual reality at the University of Southern California Institute for Creative Technologies. Skip, here something that is very important was the students and how things get taught in the school. So students face the virtual reality fields. How do they look at these days? Do you see that the students like it more than in the past? Or how is it going there?
I think we've seen a transition over the last 20 years where VR is no longer viewed as some kind of frivolous or science fiction technology, but actually a functional technology, something that matters, that is a powerful tool that can be used for different purposes, whether it's education, mental health, training, medicine, rehabilitation. So, there's been a change, and that change is driven by, I think, a couple of factors. Number one, as I said earlier, the technology has in fact caught up with the vision. If you look at what you can do with a standalone VR headset for $300 now, that has more power than what we paid $20,000 or $30,000 for just 10, 15 years ago. That's just one example. But the technology's caught up. At the same time, there's been a very large scientific literature that's evolved over the years that documents where this stuff actually adds value. So, we've got the science, we've got the technology, and probably the third thing I should mention is that we have a very passionate development community. Most people that work in the field of VR are very energetic and excited about the potential to do things in ways that we could only dream of just a few years ago. So I think universities, whereas 10, 15 years ago, I'd get emails, do you know where somebody is doing some kind of work? I'd have to look hard. Now pretty much every university has some sort of a VR presence, whether it's in computer science, whether it's in psychology, and everywhere in between. So I think there's a wider adoption and understanding of the value and the scientific benefits of studying this form of simulation technology for a useful human purpose.
And Skip, you've mentioned mental health, you've mentioned medicines there as well. With all these current environment of people more and more working from home, the population, which is getting older as well. And this brings us to the mental health question. And this is one of your areas of focus. Can you describe the ways in which virtual reality can be used to improve mental health outcomes? And also, is there any data showing that VR can optimize the effect of the drugs? And if so, can you give us a couple of examples?
Oh, well, I would say there's 4 or 5 general areas where VR has been scientifically documented to add value. Of course, in straight up psychology, looking at anxiety disorders using exposure therapy, that's a no-brainer. That's a perfect match for what VR can do, as well as with PTSD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and a wide variety of areas where putting people in simulations that help them to confront their fears, but in a safe place, and reprocess those difficult emotional memories and the brain processing that underlies them. These are areas where VR has really shown, but there are many other areas, like, for example, pain management. Back in 1999, it was shown that VR could be a very useful tool for helping to distract people from acute pain while they're undergoing a procedure, like burn wound care or other elements of surgical procedures and so on. Also, that work has evolved to chronic pain, where VR is being used to teach people skills in VR that they can learn in VR and translate to their everyday life to help manage their pain. Things like mindfulness, mental focusing, relaxation, also discomfort reduction. People that are undergoing, say, chemotherapy or dialysis, VR is finding a place there by transporting the person's psychological experience away from the discomforting setting. In the areas of post-stroke or traumatic brain injury rehabilitation, we're seeing both physical and cognitive rehabilitation being delivered in VR. In physical and occupational therapy, we see the activity of delivering rehab activities in a game-like context in VR is very motivating and engaging for patients. And these are patients that oftentimes don't do enough rehab, because without VR, some of these rehab activities are very boring, repetitive, and frustrating. So if you can do it in VR and gamify it, you see more motivation, more engagement, and consequently more trials that lead to better outcomes. There's just tons of work, even in the area of a little bit lateral, but still within VR, is the use of intelligent virtual human agents that people can interact with, and for a variety of purposes. We've done work in that area, starting with very basic stuff for people with autism on the high end of the autism spectrum. They can practice their job interviewing skills with a virtual interviewer. So it's a role play scenario. By the same token, we can do that same kind of role playing for medical training, so that we can build virtual patients that give novice clinicians a chance to practice their clinical skills with a simulated patient before they ever get their hands on a live one. And that's the same thing, of course, with surgical simulation, which is becoming more and more commonplace. Surgeons can visualize and practice how they might go into someone's brain to remove a tumor or a blood clot or whatever it is, and they can practice it in VR in a way where that visualization is in 3 dimensions. And I just saw a talk recently in Philadelphia on that topic, where the outcomes are dramatic. You're not damaging the tissue you might have damaged without that kind of visualization. But anyway, also virtual human agents for healthcare support and guidance, not a virtual therapist, not a replacement for a real person, but a way that you can have even on your mobile phone, a virtual buddy that you can talk to, that guides you through various mental health activities and gives you information about your status, perhaps driven with a connection with a Apple Watch or a Fitbit. So we're seeing a world emerge where there's a convergence of these different technologies that all come together. But at the core, we're talking about basic simulation technology. We can create simulated environments that can test, train, teach, or treat human functioning. And it's very exciting.
It is, Cap, and we see the use cases you just described, and we know that healthcare it's all about an ecosystem, and therefore there is a question that comes to our mind is about how should the healthcare providers and the organizations be trained to effectively use VR, so virtual reality technology, in patient care, and maybe asking you as well, is this already happening from your point of view?
It's happening, but at a relatively limited basis. I think the field has moved forward so quickly that now the education system for helping clinicians to learn these new learn how to operate these new tools is trying to catch up. Now, I can give you one example, one success story, and that involves our work where we developed a system for treating PTSD using exposure therapy, and primarily with combat veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. Now it's expanding to the Ukrainian population and also victims of sexual trauma. And basically the premise is you put a person in a simulation that's reminiscent of where they were traumatized. You do it gradually and you help them to go in and confront and reprocess those difficult emotional memories with the support of a clinician. Well, it's a very complex system. And by the way, we're also following the basic premise of the evidence-based approach called prolonged exposure. So we're not going off the range, coming up with some, VR treatment. It's VR to deliver an evidence-based approach. But that requires that the clinician can understand the patient, know what context they had experienced a trauma, and then select from a wide array of different scenarios. In the combat related stuff, there are 14 different worlds, an Afghan market, an Iraqi mountaintop, or driving scenario, all these different contexts. So the clinician has to be able to operate that, pull those up, then using a control panel, change the time of day, the sound effects, introduce explosions, all in real time. So that requires clinical training to understand just how to operate the tool. So we go around to veteran medical centers in the United States that have our system and do trainings for a day and a half, myself and a master clinician. And we really dig deep into helping clinicians feel comfortable using this complex system, which is very learnable. It appears complex on the front end, but it's very learnable. But it also it involves understanding the power that we have in putting patients in these kinds of simulations and the responsibility that comes with it, because it can be very emotionally evocative, beyond what sometimes a person can conjure up in their imagination. And so clinicians have to be well trained in how to pace the exposure so that they don't push the patient too fast, but they continue to get the patient to engage with things they typically avoid. So that's one example. Now, in graduate schools, say in psychology or social work, I don't see very many courses in how to implement technology. There may be many out there that I don't know, and I'm sure there's basic technology courses that review mobile phone apps or online delivery of cognitive behavioral therapy, things like that. But as far as a standardized and rigorous, program for teaching people to understand what is out there in VR, where to go to get it, how to implement therapy with it, I think we have some catching up to do in that area. And, really the clinical practice, I think, will lead the need for that kind of training. But that's an area. The sad reality is a lot of times people go to graduate school and 20 years after they get out of graduate school, they're still doing the same things that they learned in graduate school. There's some clinicians that, always trying to learn new things and keep up with the literature. But I think there's a real need for better clinical training, because a lot of times clinicians hear about it and they hear about the data and all the excitement and patient testimonials, but they don't know where to turn, or they feel like they're not capable or they're inept to use new technology. And that's just so far from the truth.
in,
So
in script, that's adoption from both sides, right? So on the clinicians side of the story, but also you've gave quite a good number of examples around how this can be used in the patient care, and you've mentioned that it needs to be based on patient by patient basis, because everyone has their own pace and you cannot push them too hard, as you were describing. But that also brings us to the topic of inclusion, right? And we're talking about adoption. It's technology-driven adoption, which is not always easy to do. So, question is, from your experience, how do you ensure that the virtual reality is accessible to patients and communities that might not have access to high-tech resources?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's still a challenge that we need to face. We don't want a digital divide to occur with the access to healthcare that can be delivered with VR. I had thought that the standalone headset approach would be a tool that would help mitigate some of that problem. And by standalone, I mean a VR headset where all the processing takes place on the headset itself. You don't need a separate computer. These are very comfortable, lightweight, high fidelity systems that really, I think, breaks down one of the barriers to care, because they're low cost. Like, I don't want to mention brand names here, but there are some that we all know that are about $300-400 that, when a clinician can open up their desk drawer and pull out a headset that's low cost and give it to a patient to take home or to use in their office, then it becomes more accessible for people of lower means. However, that's not going to solve a lot of the problems. Like, we're trying to do metaverse applications for social support with Ukrainian refugees, and that involves, in some cases, wearing a VR headset and being in a metaverse world embodied by an avatar where you can have interactions with people from anywhere in the world. Well, right now, Ukraine's a war zone. How many people have headsets? And so we had to pull back on the headset approach and look at it from delivering it in a traditional format on a regular laptop or PC on a flat screen monitor, which takes away a little bit of the immersiveness, but still provides a window into social interaction with people that have gone through similar challenges. But still, there is a requirement for equipment here. And I guess one of the solutions is that I know of a number of companies that are aiming to put a little bit of their resources towards making some of this content freely available. It still requires a headset. Will we be at a time in the near future that even people of limited resources, they still have a cell phone, typically? So will VR headsets become something like that, where perhaps every house will have one, kind of like a toaster? Every house has one. You might not use it every day, but, pretty much every house has a toaster. Will it become that way with VR headsets, so that people can access care through the cloud in an immersive environment, and in that way somewhat break down the barriers to care? But I still think it's going to take some years before it does filter down to people with lesser means, and that's unfortunate, but hard reality of the economics. Now, in the United States, where we have a pay for service kind of model, it's even a bigger challenge. The rest of the world might have a little bit easier go of it, but I'm not a healthcare economics expert, so I don't know if I can talk much more about that.
But that's fair enough, Skip. And you have been running as well product development labs and working, as you were alluding to, with the private sector. We will be really keen on understanding what are the latest innovations you have been watching in this space, and if you can give a couple of concrete examples to our audience, that will be fantastic.
Okay. Well, I see two things. I see the evolution of systems that originally came out of academia, research labs that now are pretty well formed, and now companies are licensing some of this and or building, just imitating some of the applications people developed in university settings. I see one area of this evolution with a company by the name of Penumbra. And I do have a conflict of interest. I do consult with them, so I want to make that clear. But they worked with a fella by the name of Amir Rubin, who had a company called Sixth Sense that developed a tracking system that allows, with sensors put on the body, relatively high fidelity tracking, which is key for interaction in VR. I mean, in VR, the system has to recognize your bodily actions. And typically when people use VR headsets, they have a hand controller, and there's limitations with that. But with the Penumbra system, you have sensors that are put on, say, a stroke patient's body, and it can capture full body interaction. And that has evolved dramatically. So we're taking something that's existed for a long time, but it's been evolved so that at a relatively low cost, patients can have full body interaction to support their physical rehabilitation. And that's a key element. Now, on the far end of the spectrum, even though there's been a lot of work with virtual humans in the past, now it is starting to make its way into commercial applications that might have a lot of value. There's another company out of Boston called Conversage. And again, this is one I'm talking from experience, is one I also consult with. And they're developing a virtual human that appears on a regular website, but it has a level of conversational AI, and it's being designed to help healthcare professionals that are burnt out, particularly from the post-COVID era. And healthcare professionals have a very stressful job to begin with. Doctors and nurses have some of the highest suicide rates of any occupation. So that, if that's any measure, but then with COVID on top of it, there's been a high burnout rate. So this system allows a person in those fields to privately go onto the system and talk to a virtual agent that is a supportive agent, where the agent can ask them questions about their burnout, can have them fill out screening questionnaires, and then give them feedback about where they stand on secondary PTSD, compassion fatigue, burnout, all these things that plague healthcare professionals, but they can do it privately and anonymously, and they can get feedback on where they stand. And if they're having real difficulty, the agent can say, hey, look, if you want, I can talk about some of the options for treatment, or I can give you some tips for self-care. I can lead you to support groups, whatever. But the key thing here is that it's private and anonymous. It might draw people into this kind of a setting to address their needs that they might ordinarily avoid. And what we found from the research in this area is that people have a tendency to self-disclose more personal information to a virtual human character than what they will with a real person. They feel less judged, they feel less shame, and that's an important element. So can we build these types of applications that leverage the power of AI, the good side of AI, to give people these opportunities to explore their issues in a safe, private, and anonymous way? And I think that's going to be an important movement in the future. We're building one for a mobile phone now that works with veterans that may be at risk for suicide, to build a virtual buddy. So I think that's really the bleeding edge. And I know there's a lot of controversy about AI generally, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's there's a lot of value that can come from it. You know, and what probably the most contentious issue that will come out of this, at least in my field, clinical psychology, is when people start to move more towards virtual therapists. See, what I've been describing thus far is a guide, a coach, a buddy, you know, that role. But, you know, we're not too far from people marketing AI systems that are designed so that you don't have to go and talk to a real person and get therapy. Now, that's going to be very contentious.
Hopefully that brings the superpowers to clinicians and not a replacement to them, right? Because you still need the human side of it. That's quite important.
I agree. I agree. I can't agree more. I always like to say that, look, you know, you can defend AI for a lot of reasons. Like I say, a virtual therapist, on the good side, you could say this therapist, virtual AI therapist, is always available, never tires, never gets bored. It has an encyclopedic knowledge of every clinical condition and every therapeutic approach. It remembers everything you say to it. You know, those are pretty powerful assets. However, it's missing that one key ingredient, and that is, we know that in therapy, a good percentage of the clinical outcomes are due to the therapeutic relationship. We call it the therapeutic alliance, where a patient feels comfortable that another human is understanding them, that another human can be empathetic, another human can give critical feedback in a way that maybe a friend might be hesitant, but that's all part of the therapeutic process. So I don't see a time where direct therapy will be replaced by AI just because we're humans, and I think we want to have human connection.
And Skip, so you're laying down a really good outlook for virtual reality into the future and the way it will develop. But what are the challenges? What are the limitations? Is it the human contact, the limitation, or are there any other limitations there?
You know, everything's happened so fast, and as I said earlier, we have the technology, we have the science. Of course, science never sleeps. We do need to continue to grow and understand what we're doing from a scientific perspective. So I think that it's now a healthcare system that's in transition, trying to understand. I mean, this is not an incremental change in clinical care. This is a quantum leap. To be able to put people in these simulations, control everything that goes on in them, and help a person to deal with whatever it is that they're trying to work on. This is a major transformation in the things that we can do clinically. So it's going to take some time for people to catch up and understand the value, to understand how to operate in it, understand the pitfalls. And this goes back to the earlier question about training for clinicians, getting them on board, getting them to feel comfortable, getting them to see the clinical rationale and how VR can amplify that rationale for whatever area that they're working with a patient. And so we have ways to go on this. I think the horse is out of the barn, really, though. There's no getting it back in. Technology is going to be a way that we amplify effects, but also break down barriers to care. That even though we may have a bit of a digital divide now, we do have ways to provide better access points for people that live in remote areas, that can do things in VR, in a shared VR space with a clinician, or they can do things independently, but under a clinician's supervision. There's just so many opportunities. And if, you know, I like to cite the World Health Organization, where they estimate somewhere around 1 billion people on the planet have mental health conditions, of which 2/3 will never see the inside of a therapy office. Well, why is that? What are those barriers? Is it stigma? Is it unawareness that they have a mental health condition or that they can get benefit from it, from treatment? That is. So we have a need to promote better access to mental health care. And I think technology is just one vehicle to do that. And that's what we got to work towards. There's a lot of people out there that could benefit from various forms of therapy or treatment. We've got to find ways to make it more accessible and more acceptable. I think what we've seen recently with popular celebrities talking about their mental health, Olympic athletes talking about their mental health, the shame and the stigma, that's one of the biggest bottlenecks. If we can reduce that, and maybe technology is a way to do that. Maybe we also think about promoting on a proactive level better ways of preventing mental health by creating experiences in VR that have some level of psychoeducation or resilience training or just general mental hygiene training in various ways. Maybe you can gamify some of that, make it more fun and interesting. But we need to look at this from many different perspectives because we do have a significant problem here.
We do, Skip, and what a lovely way to finish our episode. So provide better access. Definitely, we have lots of barriers, and as well you mentioned the 1 billion number, and we have on top 2 billion people in the world, according to that Access to Medicines Index, without access to basic medicines. And so there is definitely an issue out there. Skip, we want to thank you very, very much for your time and availability. Today, we talked with Albert Skip Rizzo about so many things from mental health, education. VR is getting cheaper, which will allow better access as well. The great potential of VR and its limitations and pitfalls. So it was quite an interaction. Skip, maybe the very last question. In case our audience would like to know more about you or to follow your activity, where can they find you online?
Well, of course, they can always reach out to me by email, which you can freely put in the podcast, whatever. But I also to get a quick look and hopefully a fun look, they can go to my YouTube channel. It's just Albert Skip Rizzo, one long word, and there's probably about 130 videos of a lot of our applications and also news stories, patient testimonials, and so a bunch of other fun stuff up there. So give you a quick look as to the kind of work we've been doing over the years.
We'll put those in the show notes as well. Skip, thank you very much for the really great conversation we had today. If you liked the discussion today, please push the like button below and subscribe to our podcast. In this way, we actually get more people to listen to these and other conversations here. And you can also find us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and other social networks.
Bye for now, and we hope to see you very soon for another episode of Cruzamento Podcast.
See you soon.